Welcome to everyone's fifth favorite custom card reviewer, where I will be reviewing custom cards almost as good as the four better ones, who do this way more regularly, and totally not like once every couple months. So, today, we'll be going over the Puella Magica archetype, which was sent in by someone. It is kind of long. This is probably the longest amount of cards I've gone over. There's 14 cards total, one of them's a token. And it goes over an archetype based on an anime called Puella Magica, I think, something like that, Madoka Magica, as it's more shortly named after. It's actually really good. Like, I've watched a lot of anime, it's in my top 10 for sure. It started a whole new genre after it came out. It was very influential. So, reviewing the cards, as someone who's a big fan of the series, I can kind of see where all of the effects come from. First, we'll start off with Madoka Kaname. It is a normal pendulum monster. That's fine. Pendulum monsters can be given effects, if they're a normal monster. And a lot of these cards are kind of based around the Endymion archetype. That's kind of the inspiration for how they get their effects. It's a good way to give cards a lot of effects. If you want to cram a whole bunch of references into a card, a pendulum, it allows you two different ways of getting effects. So, this one is a level 7 monster, I think. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I guess this is why in Rush Duels, when they remade the card frames, they made an easier way to find out the level of it. Because having to specifically count them out every time, kind of annoying. So it's level 7, 0/0 attack and defense. That's kind of weird for a level 7 monster, but it makes sense considering this is just supposed to be a normal, non-magical girl. So, its pendulum effect is once per turn, while it's in the pendulum zone, you can double its scale effect until the end of the turn, so it becomes a scale 8, which is fine. Once per turn, when a Puella Magi card activates its effect, place 1 grief counter on this card after it resolves, max 3. If this card has 3 grief counters on it, you can destroy this card, and if you do, special summon 1 ultimate Madoka from your extra deck. Now, this one, here's ultimate Madoka. It's kind of like Ultimate Falcon. It has 3,500 attack, it's unaffected by card effects. That's pretty good. The problem with this card, though, is, that's all it does. And it requires 3 turns, because it's a once per turn on the effect. If you could activate, get all 3 of them in 1 turn, and then you brought out, your ultimate Falcon, essentially, wouldn't be half bad. It'd be kind of good, even. But the fact that you have to wait 3 turns, and the rest of the archetype is very heavily reliant on other pendulum monsters, means you kind of have one of your scales taken up. I mean, I guess it can become level 8. A lot of the other cards are high level 2, but level 8 isn't that good. I mean, a scale 8 isn't super high. It's alright, it's not bad. 8 is kind of the one of playability if you want to play pendulum monsters, kind of. But taking 3 turns to bring it out, that's too slow. But let's go over Ultimate Madoka anyway. So, must be special summon with the effect of Madoka Kaname. Makes sense, because it's basically an Ultimate Falcon. It doesn't have the effect where it can only be special summoned that way. So, if this card is destroyed later on, you can bring it back. So, let's see. When this card is special summoned, you can place 1 or 2 Puella Magi pendulum monsters from your deck, or face some extra deck in your pendulum zone. So, when it's brought out, it allows you to set up your scales. Not half bad, I guess. Does it allow you to destroy the cards that were previously there? I think that's just how it works. I'm not 100% sure on the intricacies of pendulum zones. Unaffected by other card effects, like Ultimate Falcon. Yep. 3,500 attack, literally Ultimate Falcon. Once per turn, you can send a number of cards your opponent controls to the graveyard, up to the number of Puella Magi pendulum monsters this card points to. So it's non-targeting removal that doesn't destroy, which is pretty good. And it can get rid of possibly 3 cards with its arrows, assuming it's placed in the link zone. And since it is a pendulum archetype, they do want as many arrows as it can get, so it's not half bad. Even if it's not in that zone, you get 2 arrows pointing to the left and right. It has like the maximum amount of arrows you'd want for a pendulum deck, which is alright. And the removal is pretty good too. Can't really have better. Well, I guess it would be better if it returned the cards to the deck or something. I think returning cards to the deck is the best form of removal currently. But this is still pretty good removal. And once per turn during the end phase, place 1 spell counter on each card you control that you can place a spell counter on. During the end phase, huh? Well, I guess that's fine. Spell counters... The counter system is inherently cumbersome to use. There's a reason they don't have too many archetypes that use spell counters or just counters in general. Or why most cards that use counters are kind of doomed to fail. Because they're just like... too slow and inherently clunky to play around with, and unless they're just really broken, people usually don't bother with them. Like, think of the alien archetype. They have some really potentially broken cards, but no one uses them because counters are kind of hard to place on the field and stuff. But spell counters, like, that one has a lot of support, so that's different. Next up, we have Puella, Magi, Hamaru, Akime. Huh. I guess I'm out of practice with pronouncing Japanese names. So this one is level 7 too, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, I think they're like all level 7. Those are some really low stats for a level 7 monster. 1700, 2200 defense. When this card is activated, place 1 spell counter on it, maximum 1. While you control another Puella magic card, when a monster effect that was activated by your opponent resolves, remove 1 spell counter on this card, negate the effect. If this card has no spell counters on it, you can destroy this card. So, most of them will have an effect similar to this in their pendulum scales, where, when they're first activated, you get to place 1 spell counter on them, and they only hold like 1 spell counter max. Also, they have an effect they can use that spell counter for, and they have the optional effect to destroy themselves if they do not have a spell counter, which allows them to activate their monster effect. Where if this card is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can set a spell trap card from your deck that specifically lists this card in its text. So it can float, it can destroy itself in order to activate the float, and it goes to the extra deck. That's, good hallmarks of a pendulum card. Pendulum monsters love to destroy themselves in the pendulum scale, so they can take advantage of the fact that their monster effects activate. It's a little tricky thing that most pendulum monsters kind of embrace. It wasn't super common like when pendulum monsters first came out. Even though like one of the first pendulum monsters had an effect where it activated by destroying itself. But generally, it's the good archetypes of pendulums who gain effects when they're destroyed. Anyways, its pendulum effect of being able to negate card effects, that's pretty good. No real complaint there. That's probably one of the best of all of them. 1 spell counter, negate 1 monster effect. Can't go wrong with that. Now, its other effects, when it is a monster, if this card is pendulum summoned, you can place 1 spell counter on it, but it can only have a maximum of 2. And it gains 300 attack and defense for each spell counter on it. That's kind of, too much to keep track of. Like, if you think of one of the reasons counter cards are annoying to deal with is because you have to keep track of so many things with them, like when you play with them in a physical sense. If you play it online, none of this really matters because it's tracked automatically, but think of how much trackers you need in order to, keep track of spell counters, and then keep track of the fact that its attack and defense is modified for the amount of spell counters. It's just a little cumbersome. So usually what you could do is just not have them gain anything for having counters, unless that's the whole point of the card, or just give them the attack baseline, because the attack and defense is already really low as is. Like 1700 for a level 7 monster is pretty bad. When your opponent activates a card or effect that targets a card you control, you can remove a spell counter from this card to negate the activation. So it allows you to negate targeted effects, and I don't think that's once per turn. So if it has 2 spell counters on it, you can negate 2 targeted effects. Now, most good cards don't target. So if you play against a good deck, you probably won't have that protection. Only probably, though. I mean, you still have, like, Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, who does see play, well, not as much as anymore, but it did see a lot of play, and it had protection about targeting, but that was kind of an added bonus and not really something you played the card for. And also, its last effect is the floating effect, which I already went over. If it's destroyed, you get to add a card with its name. So let's see the card that it adds. It is Hamru's Shield. Hamura, I think it's pronounced. It's a continuous spell card. You can only control one Hamura Shield. Each time a Puella magic card is activated, place 1 time counter on this card. Maximum 3. When the effect resolves, during your end phase, if all monsters you control are Puella Magi monsters, you can remove 3 time counters from this card, and banish 1 Puella Magi monster you control into your opponent's end phase to activate one of these effects. Or, if you banished Puella Magi Hamuru Akimi, you get to activate both of these effects in sequence, where you get to skip your opponent's next draw phase, and skip your opponent's next main phase 1. So basically, if you have this card out, and you activate 3 Puella Magi monster effects, then you'll get 3 counters. Then during the end phase, assuming you're playing a xenophobic deck which only has Magi cards in it, Puella Magi cards, and you banish one of them so you lose advantage in the process, then you get the effect to skip your opponent's draw phase, which does, -1 them, I guess, and their main phase 1, which is kind of the same as skipping their battle phase, because they just immediately go to their battle phase, and if they have no cards, then they can just immediately go to main phase 2. And then, they have no battle phase that turn. That's fine. It's not very good. Like, I wouldn't play this card if I was using Hamuru Akimi. I'd probably just play her for the effect and to get cards. It's very thematic. Like, in the anime, she has the ability to go back in time. And you don't want to just have a full-on skip your opponent's turn, so like skipping half the turn with a whole bunch of restrictions sounds fine in theory, but it's a little bit too restrictive. Like, there's a spirit monster who's, I think his name is like Big Nose. He skips your opponent's main phase 1 if he inflicts battle damage. It's really not that big a deal, but it is a nice effect if you can get it on top of something else that's good. This doesn't really do that though. You have to go out of your way to get the effect. Even if you can float into it, you have to lose advantage to use the effect. So not very good. Next up we have Puella Magi Sayaka Miki. This one actually has decent scales baseline. I forgot about that. Hamuru's scales are 6 for some reason. Like, I assume it's meant to play with this card. How are the scales in the other one? I guess they're all 6 and 8. Okay, so 6 and 8. So I guess you can only play the Puella Magica cards with them. I guess that's a compromise for not having in their text that you can only pendulum summon these cards. So, like all the other ones, when this card's activated in the pendulum scale, it gets a spell counter, and its effect, if you remove a spell counter, is to special summon a Puella Magi pendulum monster from your hand or graveyard, and if you do, you can place up to 3 spell counters on that monster. And if this card has no spell counters, you can destroy it, which will then allow you to activate its floating effect from its monster portion, where if it's destroyed, you can set a spell or trap from your deck that specifically lists this card in its text. So, just like Hamuru, how she can float into Hamuru's shield, set it in the spell trap card zone while setting up the pendulum zone. That's neat. This effect allows you to special summon a monster from your hand or graveyard. The fact that the graveyard is an option is pretty good. Even though pendulum monsters don't really hit the graveyard very often, they do hit the graveyard, just not very often. You kind of have to go out of your way to get them there. So, from your hand too, that's not as good, but it's alright. There are lots of ways pendulum decks can kind of stuff their hand with more pendulum monsters in a way that gains them advantage, so it's alright. If it was from the deck, that would be kind of really good. But I can understand why that's not the case. If it's hand or graveyard, it's a nice option to have both of those. The deck is probably a little bit too much. You really want to avoid having monsters special summon monsters from the deck. So I can understand the balance limit here there. So, its stats are also really low for a level 7 monster. Its effects, when it's a monster, is if this card is pendulum summoned, place a spell counter on it. maximum 2. Gain 300 attack and defense for each spell counter on it. They really shouldn't have those effects. It's needless like bean counting when they already have really low stats baseline. I can understand why they have low stats. It's because, you know, they're supposed to gain more attack for the spell counters, but they don't really gain a lot of attack. And it's not really necessary. Twice per turn, you can remove 1 spell counter from this card to target a Puella Magi card you control and place a spell counter on it. Wait. Except this card. Oh, that you can place a spell counter on, and then you can place up to 3 spell counters on it. Okay. I thought it was remove 1 spell counter to replace 1 spell counter somewhere else. It's remove 1 spell counter to place up to 3 spell counters on something else. If this card is destroyed by a card effect, you can set 1. Okay, so its effect is basically to just add spell counters to your other cards. That's not really good. I hate to say. That's not very good. Spell counters, just adding spell counters, it doesn't really do anything. Like, you'd have to spend resources to get this card on the field. And then you have to use its 1 spell counter to just add more spell counters to something else that you have to set up. And then it doesn't really gain any other advantage or do anything else, and its stats are kind of low. But its Pendulum Zone effect is not half bad. So I guess if you just use this card as a Pendulum monster and ignore its monster effect, and maybe it can potentially float into something useful? Let's see. Psychic Healing, quick play spell. If this card is set by the effect of its Pendulum monster, you can activate the card the turn it was set. Alright, that's good. And the effect is place 1 spell counter on each Puella Magi card you control, you can place a spell counter on. Then, if you control a Puella Magi Sayaka Miki, you can place 1 more spell counter on each Puella Magi card you can place a spell counter on. Also, this turn, Puella Magi cards you control cannot be destroyed by battle, and you take no battle damage. Alright, so it just adds a whole bunch of spell counters to monsters. And gives them some minor protection. That's not super useful on your turn. During your opponent's turn, battle protection isn't super useful either. Like, unless it does something else good. It does do something else, but I wouldn't call putting spell counters on things good. It's alright, because the deck, you know, needs their spell counters to do things. But, like, you know, take a note from the Endymion archetype, where they have spell counters technically, but they do a whole bunch of really broken shit with those spell counters. That's why they see play, and even then they don't really see that much play, considering how broken they are. That's because, like, the inherent limitations of pendulum monsters. There is some stuff that makes them a little bit better. Like, these are very balanced so far. Which, you know, that's kind of the scale with custom cards. They're either, like, incredibly broken or unbalanced or a little bit undertuned. It's really hard to, like, hit the middle ground, because, like, if you try to make them competitive, it's real easy to accidentally go into, like, overpowered tier. These ones seem to be very intentionally tried to be balanced, which is good. It's just they're a little bit weak as far as I'm seeing. Besides the big boss monster, which is basically Ultimate Falcon. This one seems pretty good, even if it's not viable to be brought out. You know, kind of like the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon fusions. Some of them have some pretty good effects, but they're too cumbersome to bring out so they don't see play. So, next up we have Puella Magi Mami Tomoe. When this card is activated, place 1 spell counter on it. When a monster your opponent controls declares an attack, you can remove 1 spell counter from this card to negate that attack. And if this card has no spell counters, you can destroy it. And of course, this one has a monster effect, where if it's destroyed, you can set a spell or trap from your deck that specifically lists this card in its text. And in this case, it's Mami's Trio Finale. It's a trap card. If this card was set by the effect of its named pendulum monster, you can activate it the turn it was set. And it allows you to destroy all monsters with ribbon counters your opponent controls. And if you control the named pendulum monster, you can banish them instead. Not half bad. So, its pendulum effect, where you can negate an attack, is incredibly mediocre. Sure, technically it's useful. Don't get me wrong. Negating an attack is useful. It's just on the scale of useful effects, it's pretty low on the totem pole. And then it can destroy itself to float into a trap card, which can destroy things only if they have counters on it. So the monster effect, is when this card is pendulum summoned, place 2 spell counters on it, maximum 3. Gains attack for each spell counter on it. Can go up to 3. It has 300, so it can go up to 2900 attack if it has all 3 spell counters, which is what it really should have attack baseline. Like, if it's a level 7 monster, 2900 attack is kind of normal. And let's see, once per turn, quick effect, you can remove up to 3 spell counters from this card, place that many ribbon counters amongst face-up monsters on the field. And monsters with ribbon counters are changed to defense position, their defense becomes 0, and that's it. So the ribbon counters, they go out, you have to spend 3 spell counters, she only gets 2 when she's brought out, because remember, when a card like moves from the pendulum zone to the monster zone, they don't keep spell counters. Not that this card does that. That's something the pendulum, the Endymion archetype does. So you need to find a way to give her 1 more spell counter, because she doesn't have a way to give herself spell counters outside of a pendulum summon, which obviously is the intended use of Sayaka and her support cards. But the effect is... It is a quick effect. Okay. A quick effect in order to change all your opponent's monsters to defense position. That's alright. Like, you know, there is Ultimate Conductor Tyranno who does something similar, except its effect can allow you to gain advantage and can be set up immediately, and flips the cards face down, while this one just puts them in defense position, sets their defense to 0. It can stop a battle phase. It can allow you to attack over all of your opponent's non-link monsters. It's alright, I guess. It requires more setup, like you can't use it on its own. You need something else to give it an additional spell counter. And then its quick effect is live. That's a little bit too cumbersome. And then it needs its trap card in order to remove those cards that have the counters on it. Yeah, I don't know about that. And this is another type of counter. So far we have spell counters, time counters, grief seed counters, and now ribbon counters. Like, it's real easy to keep track of them, because they all do like one specific thing. Spell counters for all their effects to be activated as a resource. And then the other ones, they're specifically different counters so that you can't use the spell counter mechanic to cheese them. You know, no adding spell counters to your opponent's cards in order to use them later. If instead of adding a whole bunch of counters to your opponent's cards, it just did what this card does baseline, this would be really good, especially since it has that quick effect. And it would be balanced by the fact that it has the spell counter thing where it needs to add a spell counter in order to even do it in the first place. But as it is now, that's too much setup for removal. That's just way too much. Let's go into the next one. Puella Magi Kyoko Sakura. Wait. Let's see, like, is that fire symbol cutting off some of its name? No, I think it just ends there at a weird point. Okay, so another level 7 card. When this card is activated in the pendulum zone, you can place a spell counter on it. And you can remove 1 spell counter from this card in order to make it so that your effects, Puella Magi monsters that are normal or special summoned cannot be negated. Your opponent cannot activate cards or effects is normal or special summoned. If this card has no spell counters, okay, I get it. So your opponent can't like negate their summons with like Solemn Judgment or stuff like that. It gives them spell speed 4 summoning effects, like the god cards. And then, if this card has no spell counters, you can destroy it, which will allow you to activate its monster effect, where, if this card's destroyed, you can set the spell or trap from your deck that specifically lists this card in its text. So in this case, it's Kyokyo's Spear, which is an equip card. It can only be equipped to a Puella Magi Pendulum monster. The equipped monster gains 500 attack and defense. That's kind of a very small amount of attack and defense to gain. Also, if it battles, your opponent's card effects cannot be activated until the end of the damage step. If the equipped monster is a Puella Magi Kyoko Sakura, it gains the following effect, where, if it attacks a defense position monster, inflict double piercing battle damage. Okay, so the spear is very weak. It doesn't give you anywhere near enough attack to be worth playing. Like, if you're gonna play an equip spell card, it needs to give, the gold standard nowadays is this little old card called, here, let me bring it up, off on the side, but through the power of editing, you'll see it on screen. A card called Grid Rod. Grid Rod has the effect that when it's equipped to a Cybers monster, they're just straight up unaffected by card effects. Like, they gain ultimate Falcon levels of protection. It also gives them an incredibly minor amount of attack too, and if the card is destroyed, your Cybers monsters gain protection for the rest of the turn. That's kind of like the gold standard of like an archetype specific equip card. Grid Rod is really powerful and sees no play. And the spear is very limiting in comparison. It also gives a minor amount of attack. It can only be equipped to an incredibly specific subset of monsters, and the effects it gives are really not worth playing the card at all, even if you can get it straight from the deck. Your opponent not being able to activate card effects during the damage step, that's like a neat bonus, but you know, you have to make it to the damage step first. And then like all their attacks are kind of low, 2100, you can only go by 500. Double piercing battle damage, like what's that one card? The Blue Eyes card, Blue Eyes Chaos Dragon Max. It has 4000 attack. It deals double piercing battle damage, and it doesn't see play, even though it's also immune to destruction and targeting. Because, you know, battle effects like that on incredibly hard to summon monsters, not incredibly hard, just non-generic summon monsters is not a big deal. Those effects on generic summoned monsters are a big deal though. You know, there's cards like Borrelsaur Dragon, who has a battle related effect. If it was part of a specific archetype that was hard to bring out, it probably wouldn't be a big deal or see no play, but because that effect is tied to a generic card, it sees tons of play and is like one of the best link monsters. So what I'm trying to say, if you have an archetype specific card which only has battle related effects, you're allowed to go a little crazy. You don't need to balance it around like generic cards, because there's like a huge, you know, world of difference between battle related effects for specific archetypes versus battle related effects for generic cards, you know, like a Utopia the Lightning. So I think this card is actually just beaten out by generic cards too, which is kind of low on the power scaling. So let's go over its pendulum effects. When this card's pendulum summoned, you can place a spell counter on it, maximum 2. Gains attack for the spell counters. Once per turn, you can move up to 2 spell counters from this card to special summon that many tokens. The tokens was shown at the very beginning of the video. They have the same stats as this card baseline. They can't attack directly, nor be used as link materials except for the link summon of a Puella Magi link monster. You know, that reminds me, what was the link arrows of the Ultimate Falcon card? Yeah, I think they forgot to add a way to summon this card outside of its special condition. Like, even if a card is obviously intended to be brought out in a special way, they still need to have like a token, you know, way to bring them out normally. Like a lot of the XC's monsters, they obviously have ways that they're supposed to be brought out, and you're not supposed to bring them out through their intended way, but they still have something written on them anyway. Like all of the, whatchamacallit, the Zodiac monsters, some of those have ridiculous summoning requirements because they're not meant to be brought out normally. You know, you gotta at least add something like that to it. So they're tokens which can't be used as link materials except for the link summon of another card, which is pretty good. I'll go over that in a bit. That does a lot of, it goes a long way to solving some of the problems inherent to these archetypes, to these cards. Summoning tokens, they can still be used as synchro materials when they're high level tokens, except this deck is incredibly xenophobic, so you couldn't really play too many tuners with it to take advantage of those tokens for synchros anyway. And let's see, baseline it can summon 1 token. You'd need to have a way to add a second spell counter in order to summon 2 tokens. So it still needs outside support, like most of the other ones. Most of the cards can't really do anything on their own. They need the help of everyone else. And if this card is destroyed, oh yeah, the floating effect, which goes into the spear, which I've already talked about, it's kind of weak. Equip spell cards need to be incredibly powerful to see play, and even cards like Grid Rod don't see play, and they are incredibly powerful. So unless the equip card like summons monsters, it's not going to be good. Now, well, I say not good and all this stuff. I'm doing all of these things based on like competitive play. I definitely judge all these things based on like the good decks. You know, like how would this card compare to Endymion or Virtual World, stuff like that. I do the same for gimmick decks too. Like the only thing I play are gimmick decks. Like whenever I stream, people yell at me because I won't play meta decks. It's really funny. They come in, they get mad. It's like, why don't you play good decks? It's like, because I don't want to. So I say all these things comparing them to meta decks because even though the only thing I play are gimmick decks, I have to play them in a way where they can at least compete. You know, you have to build them as best as possible so that your gimmick decks have a chance to win, because you can win against good decks if you draw really good and your opponent doesn't. But if your deck is just completely unplayable and has garbage in it, then you won't win even if you draw really good and your opponent doesn't. Especially since a lot of the games are like one-offs. You know, when it comes to side decking, your chances of winning a match go down the hole. But if you have a gimmick deck, you do have an actual good chance of winning a single game against a good deck. Not all the time. Some of those decks are incredibly consistent and they'll always pull out a big board that you can't do anything about. And that's kind of what I'm comparing these things to. Even like as an expert on only playing gimmick decks, I have to keep in mind what the meta is so that I'm not completely shut down and can actually do stuff. So, next card. Puella, Magi, Madoka Kaname. So this is the actual magical version of Madoka, the namesake of the series. Its pendulum effect is you can remove one spell counter from this card, add one Puella Magi pendulum monster from your deck to your hand, with a different name from the Puella Magi cards you control or face up in your extra deck. If this card has no spell counters, you can destroy this card. That's pretty good. You actually get to search off of its effect. It's one of the few that has like actual good benefits. Some of the other ones are good too. Like one of them allows you to negate an effect, which is good too. A lot of their pendulum effects are pretty good, even if some of them are kind of mediocre. Its effect, if it's destroyed, you know, because it's monster effect, is you can add a Puella Magi card with Madoka Kaname in its card text. So it's this one, Madoka's Friends, where it allows you to add a Puella Magi monster from your deck to your hand, except Madoka. And if you control a Madoka, you can add 2 Puella Magi monsters instead. And you can activate one of these cards per turn. So if this card floats into this one, it won't actually be able to use the effect, but it still gets to search, which is good. This is like the search card of the deck, like the reinforcements of the army, but if you also control this card on the field, you get to search 2 cards, which is even better. That's just straight up +1. Those are the kinds of advantage cards you need, considering how much setup a lot of these cards require. Okay, so what are its effects? It gains 500 attack for each spell counter on it. It can only have 1, and this one has 2500 attack baseline. This is like the only one with an actual decent stat line for a level 7 monster. And it goes up to 3000 if it has a spell counter on it. Once per turn, you can remove 1 spell counter from this card, then target 1 card your opponent controls and destroy it. That's good. If this card is destroyed, you can add the spell card. Okay, so this one's one of the most basic ones. Basic as in simple effects. 1 spell counter, destroy 1 card, gains 500 attack, floats into a card that searches, and can search with its pendulum effect. This is definitely the best card so far, just in terms of like setting up everything else. All the other things, they all have their own little gimmicks to them. This one is like the best card that would probably play 3 of if you were playing this deck, just because it sets up everything else so nicely. I will say though, a lot of these cards, like their spell counters, the amount of attack they gain, the amount of spell counters they need to have on them to spend and everything, they're kind of inconsistent. Like some of them can hold 1, some can hold 2, some can hold 3, some of them require you to spend 3, spend 1. If I were to suggest fixes, I would say keep those all uniform. Like they all either can hold 1 to 3, or only 1, only 2, only 3. They can only spend 1 spell counter to do something, or they all require 3 spell counters to do something. Just so there's not like so much bookkeeping with like, okay, this one can hold 2, this one can only hold 1, and this one can only hold 3, but this one requires you to spend 2 in order to do it, but this one requires you to spend 3. It's just, is not a big deal, but like, you have to think of it from like a new player's perspective. Someone who's playing this deck for the first time, that's a lot of new things to remember. You kind of have to keep it uniform. That's like how a lot of the archetypes work. If they do something gimmicky, then all of them kind of do it in the same way. Alright, so that's the search card, and then their link monster, their second one. It just requires 2 Puella Magi monsters as materials, cannot be used as link material, and when it's summoned, you get to add an Incubator spell or trap card from your deck to your hand, which is this card, which allows you to destroy a Puella Magi card in order to add a Madoke Kaname, or a Puella Magi monster from your deck or extra deck to your hand. So it's an inherent -1. Because you have to destroy in order to add a card, plus you have to spend this card from your hand to do it. However, pretty much all of the Puella Magi cards float, so, you know, it evens out. It's not half bad. And during your main phase, you can special summon any number of Puella Magi cards with different names from your hand or face-up extra deck. And if you do, place up to 9 spell counters amongst those monsters that you can place spell counters on. See, that's good. That's just straight up good. Its pendulum arrows are kind of weak for that effect. You know, because it's left or right, and pendulum monsters really need their pendulum zones, which is kind of explained by its last effect, where if you control a Puella Magi card, you can special summon this card from the graveyard. And you can only use each of its effects once per turn, and they're hard once per turns. So that's really good, because you can't special summon a link monster from your graveyard to your link zone. So it would have to go to one of your main monster zones, and it would give you 2 extra spots to pendulum summon monsters too. And its effect to special summon a whole bunch of the other cards is just a once per turn that doesn't have any resource costs or special requirements to it. So this is the real power card of the archetype, and it only requires 2 monsters too, which is entirely reasonable. And its effect to bring itself out from the graveyard is kind of strong too. That's really strong. Once per turn, you just get it out for free, and then it gives you 2 extra zones to pendulum summon to. And it can just special summon a bunch of cards, and then give them all the spell counters they need. It's kind of a weird one to give them spell counters, but it's basically going to fill up all those cards with spell counters, no problem. So this is the real power card of the archetype. Everything just revolves around this. Like, if you were going to try to counter this deck, you could just play Lithos a Gym to remove this card from the extra deck and you'd win. Because they can't really do anything, like, they're all inherently balanced, and I think the reason that's why is because they have such a good link monster. Like, this is a really good link monster, like, holy crap. If you want something to really carry your archetype, that's how you do it. Okay, last card. It's basically the Wavering Eyes of the archetype. Apply this card in sequence based on the number of Puella Magi pendulum monsters you control with different names. So, if you have all 5 of them, you get all 5 of the effects. If you have one of them, you get to add a Puella Magi monster from your deck to your hand. So, if you just have one card out, it's Reinforcements of the Army. That's pretty good. Second one, you get to increase all their attacks by 500. Meh. 3 or more, you get to add 2 face-up Puella Magi pendulum monsters from your extra deck to your hand. So, if you have 3 cards out, this card becomes a +2 in card advantage, which is really good. With 4 cards, 1,000 damage, that's really weak. And 5, you get to send all your opponent's cards to the graveyard. That's probably not going to happen. That's too much setup. And it's not even that good of an effect for how much setup that requires. So what you'd want to do is just get 3 cards out, which is entirely reasonable, considering how broke this Link monster is. And they do have some good searching with Madoka and her support cards. So the other ones can be kind of used as like link materials for other stuff. Because that's a lot of advantage that these cards generate. And I don't think this has any like restrictions on your summons for the turn. It just allows you to special summon a whole bunch of cards from your hand or face up extra deck. And if you do, place 9 spell counters on it. Like, this is a special summon, not a pendulum summon, so it doesn't really matter. It ignores Master Rule 4 revisions. That's broke. That's strong. Okay, that's the full archetype. This is, wow, an incredibly long video. This is why I have that limitation of only, like, 4 to 8 cards. This was a special exception, though. The reason I went through this whole thing, first and foremost, because I like Madoka Magica. Secondly, because this was, one of the requests from a high-tier patron. So, you know, if they had come to me with 15 cards, you know, and they had the requirements to pick any one video they wanted, I would tell them just to pick their 8 best. However, I like the Archetype because I like the anime. So like, okay, that's fine, I'll do it. I'll do all 15. This is an outlier, though. I don't plan on doing this again unless it's like another thing built on an anime that I actually like. So, final grades and everything. My grading scale. Grading scale. Power. Too strong. If it's too strong, it's bad. This is definitely not too strong. A lot of the cards are kind of weak even. It does have an incredibly strong Link monster though, which sets up everything. So I'd probably give it a 2 in power. 2 out of 3. Creativity. It definitely is creative. All their effects are based on their anime counterparts for sure. I can give it a... it might be a little bit too creative even, because there's like a whole bunch of different kinds of counters and everything. I can give it full points, sure. 4 out of 4 in creativity. And viability. Is it at least tier 2? Probably not. It's not terrible though. So 2 out of 3 points for that. So that would give it a final grading scale of an 8 out of 10. Pretty good. It just needs a little bit of adjustments. Probably uniform the spell counter stuff, increase their attacks, give some of the other ones a little bit better effects, and leave some of the other ones alone. That Link monster is just straight up broken. Incubator, QB, straight broken. I love it. This card would probably get... I don't know if it would get banned though, because like the cards it brings out, half of them are kind of weak. And they only gain a spell counter. Well, I mean, it gives them spell counters too. Yeah, this card is just broken. It kind of... It's like... Reminds me of Spellbook of Judgment. It's kind of needed because the rest of the cards don't really function without it. Alright, so that's it for this. If you have a custom card review you want, send it to my Twitter. Don't send me messages to my business email. I get some people who send me messages through there. And I just ignore all those messages. Twitter only. The reason I have it on Twitter is so I can vent them easier. Vet them. Okay, and that's it. Until the next custom card review.